before starting this company, I spent a lot of time in supply chain and transportation on both sides of the table, picking away at this problem and seeing sort of the persistent issues that are there. And broadly speaking, B2B transportation, we work with long-haul trucks. Long-haul trucking in the US is an $850 billion industry, and we waste between a third to half of the trucking capacity in this country every day. We all pay for that. The buyers and sellers pay for it, but we all pay for those wasteful emissions, just the amount of human talent that gets wasted focusing on one load at a time. Leaf has been purpose-built to build a data foundation that allows for freight to be coordinated across parties. What my 18, 19-year journey prior to starting Leaf showed me was even the biggest, most sophisticated buyers of transportation, we would call shippers in industry jargon, basically buy their trucking capacity 24 to 48 hours in advance. That's pretty much how trucking works. We do something fundamentally different. We go to those enterprise shippers, and we focus on the enterprise shippers very deliberately, and ask them for their demand data. We've built machine learning algorithms to analyze those data and help those shippers plan what can be planned. And then we contract for those using a digital contract that Reitler helped us develop when we were getting started just in beta. And it sounds like this should be happening already, but what we call contracts and freight are not really contracts. They're really just a price that's been agreed between both parties, but Johnson & Johnson as a shipper is not obligated to ship anything, and the carrier is not obligated to say yes when Johnson & Johnson calls. If they both agree to ship something together 48 hours from now, the price has been agreed. That's what we call contracts. So not really contracts in the rest of the world, but in freight, that's what passes. So we built a digital contract that says, look, we can plan ahead, we understand the demand that will flow, weeks, maybe months in advance, and let's contract for it and let the other party know. Pretty simple concept. But with that contract, we have an advantage at Leaf where we start to see this demand and this planned and scheduled contracted capacity across parties. So now for the first time at scale using software, we can start to connect a load from a packaging company to Johnson & Johnson's Listerine and Tylenol that they're sending, and then something that Sam's Club will send out to its stores. And we can do that at scale using what we call network moves. That generates unprecedented efficiencies. I'll show you a little bit about sort of how the software works. But the problem that we're solving for our customers like Johnson & Johnson is what we call portfolio management. There will be stuff that happens every day. There'll be somebody who needs 3 truckloads of Tylenol because in COVID, demand for Tylenol surged. You can't plan for that. You still have to deal with the real world in real life. But it turns out that over 90% of Johnson & Johnson's truckload freight can be planned ahead, contracted, leaving the bandwidth for those creative humans that work at J&J in transportation management to focus on those crazy things that we couldn't have anticipated. That increases reliability and significantly reduces costs. So we work with shippers, industry-leading shippers, because honestly, it's kind of cute that we're doing some stuff with technology, but the fact that J&J or Owens Corning or Anheuser-Busch is using Leaf is more important to our future customers. And we also work very deliberately with the logistics service providers. We're not trying to get in the way of relationships that have been built over 20 or 30 years. We're actually generating efficiencies that help both parties. And the problem really boils down to this. Obviously, if you're a trucking company, you want your trucks full and your drivers busy. Everyone's been picking away at that problem for a while. But our industry really lacks the fundamental infrastructure, specifically data, to do this in a coordinated manner. And this is sort of a cartoon version of the problem. J&J is a shipper, and then there's a bunch of logistics service providers, some who own trucks and have trucking fleets, and some who don't own any assets and are brokers. Every year, Johnson & Johnson will conduct an RFP. In the first startup I was involved with, we built the first generation RFP technology, floppy disks, so it sort of explains the hair loss. But since then, really, the RFP approach hasn't changed fundamentally. J&J still does an annual RFP, and they send it to about 200 to 300 logistics service providers that they have some awareness of, some relationship with. And then they negotiate these contracts that aren't real contracts. They negotiate rates on every route that J&J might ship Listerine or Tylenol. $100 million worth of trucking, but essentially all they've got are prices, and every day they get up and they try to cover loads. Today they'd be trying to book things for Monday. That's what the team at J&J is doing, with 200 or 300 logistics service providers. But that's just a very small subset of the 600,000 plus trucking companies and 20,000 brokers that operate in the US alone. So the chances that the packaging company that's bringing brown paper boxes into J&J's facility, that trucking company runs around the other side of the warehouse, picks up Listerine and goes out, it just doesn't happen. We see it in the data. Those companies don't use the same provider. The chance that the same truck driver is actually getting that useful turn on the asset, it just doesn't happen. So we're purpose-built to illuminate the transportation grid, we call it. We use our machine learning algorithms embedded in software that Johnson & Johnson pays a subscription fee for. They stream this data to us on a regular cadence, and we show a pattern of what can be planned by Johnson & Johnson just on a standalone single-player basis. And on a third or so of their transportation requirements for the year, $30-odd million, they can pre-book it a year in advance and they wouldn't have to think about it, leaving them a little bit more bandwidth to focus on other stuff. But as soon as we process Johnson & Johnson's data in alongside 450 other shippers' demand data that we've now got on the platform, we start to see that opportunity to forward contract double, typically. And that's because Johnson & Johnson isn't the only company shipping from New Jersey down to Florida. There's a bunch of other folks going the same direction. But more interestingly, J&J had done this analysis on their own. They looked at their $100 million, they were preparing for their RFPs, and they realized that about 32 times a year, they could find something going from a J&J facility to another and then something coming back. They were looking for those, but 32 times a year wasn't worth putting any effort behind. As soon as we put J&J in alongside the data set, we found two interesting insights. One, the number of round trips approached 3,000, and the number of these three-legged circuits at the bottom right approached 10,000 right away. So a bunch of their freight fit with other people's freight. And the second insight was, it was actually just finding the two needles in the haystack out of the 450. It wasn't about volume and scale, it was about coordination. It was about finding the puzzle pieces that fit snugly next to the other. And so we started contracting with the logistics service providers on the other side to do the thing that they care about the most, which is keeping the truck busy and the driver full. In our industry, half the time, the driver's basically paid like a glorified gig worker. If he or she is driving empty, that's on them. If they're waiting around for a load or they're waiting to unload the truck, they don't get paid. So all of that comes out of, effectively their pocket. A circuit like this, which we started very presciently in February of 2020, just before COVID happened, kept the truck driver, and the truck driver's name was Gary. We love telling the Gary story at the company. Gary now, instead of just waiting for the request 48 hours in advance, had 3 sets of demands knit together for him in a circuit. He left his house in the morning, finished his route, slept in his bed at night. Sounds obvious, and we would imagine that trucking fleets are working on this all the time, but if they don't see those different pieces, it's impossible to coordinate this. That circuit's been running since February 2020, and this little COVID thing that happened in between that made trucking a lot more complicated and a lot more expensive. Gary's rate, his trucking company's rate, didn't change a penny. Why? Because Gary's got something reliable. His earnings have doubled, and again, very importantly for him, just from a human standpoint, he sleeps in his bed every night. It's very reliable for the provider. Johnson & Johnson and a couple other shippers are saving 25% on these types of circuits, and 10,000 more of these that Johnson & Johnson can take advantage of. Over 90% of their freight can be orchestrated. So that's really what we're purpose-built for, to try to knit together well over 90%, at least analytically, as we look across our data set, a coordinated transportation grid. We're working to scale this up with a dozen or so really big shippers like J&J, and building some interesting sort of new products on top of this, in addition to the software, payments solutions that can't be built until and unless you have this sort of coordinated understanding. And our aspiration one day is to have these data be sort of the underpinning, the first data set that exists in transportation that looks forward as opposed to just backwards, and can be used to create fundamentally different ways of doing business. Thank you.